Welcome to Highline BI 348 class video number 40. Hey, if you want to download this workbook, BI 348 chapter 2.75, example 1 start file, or the PowerPoint file, click on the link below the video. Hey, we're going to start in PowerPoint. And this is going to be an amazing chapter because we're going to have an introduction to building data models with PowerPivot. And PowerPivot is an amazing new add-in in Excel that does just what it says. It's going to be building pivot tables, but they are going to be supercharged, powerful pivot tables where we can have big data behind the scenes, as many tables as we want, and a whole new formula language to build formulas for our pivot table. Now let's go look at our topics. We will talk about what is PowerPivot. We'll talk about which versions contain PowerPivot, because not all versions have PowerPivot. We'll talk about what the data model is. We will remind ourselves about the columnar database. We'll talk about data modeling, related tables, and we'll have some references for more advanced PowerPivot and data modeling. And there's been a couple really awesome books written lately. Next slide for topics. For each one of our PowerPivot examples, we'll see how to import data using mostly Power Query, because Power Query is the tool for importing, cleaning, and transforming data. We'll see how to create relationships between related tables. We'll get to use the new DAX formula language to build formulas that we can use in our pivot tables. We'll see that there are two types of formulas in DAX: calculated columns and calculated fields or measures. And then, of course, we'll build our pivot tables and charts based on the data model, refresh, and watch our reports and dashboards update. Now, we first want to go to slide number 4 and talk about what is PowerPivot. The overview. PowerPivot is a big data reporting and analytics tool that uses the pivot table user interface to build reports. It has a columnar database that can hold big data, millions of records. We talked about this amazing columnar database last chapter. PowerPivot will allow us to create relationships between related tables. We don't have to use VLOOKUP. We'll learn about the new DAX formula language that can be used to create formulas for our pivot tables. And PowerPivot is called PowerPivot because it is a supercharged version of the pivot table we already know and love. And it's supercharged because we can use big data and we can make better formulas than before. Now, PowerPivot is a COM add-in that is available in Excel 2010 or later. And PowerPivot is, in essence, two things. It is the data model, which means the data, the relationships, and the formulas that we build. And 2, the pivot table based on the data model. That's PowerPivot. Now, not all versions of Excel have PowerPivot. So which versions? Well, in Excel 2013, Office 2013 Professional Plus, standalone Excel. That means you just buy Excel without Office. And then Office 365 E3 or E4. In 2016, Office 2016 Professional. That's much better because that's usually the one we all have as a professional. You can also get it in the standalone and then Office 365 Professional Plus editions. Now, what is the data model? At its essence, it is 1, 2, 3 things. It is the columnar database. We can import big data into this database. We can create relationships between related tables, and the DAX formula language to create formulas for the pivot table. It's those 3 things together. So when people say data model, we have built and organized and modeled this data in preparation of making our reports. The columnar database lets us bring in big data and will perform with the DAX formulas quickly on that big data. We build our relationships so we don't have to use VLOOKUP. And DAX. Now, DAX, D-A-X, data analysis expression. Now, it's the X that represents the X right there for expression. And expression just means formulas. Now, the amazing thing is, and when you start looking through the function list, you're not going to believe there are many more DAX functions in PowerPoint than there are in a pivot table, of course. And also, there's a bunch of crazy functions we're going to wish we had over in an Excel spreadsheet. Functions like same period last year. So on a pivot table, if you have a week or a year or a month and you use the same period last year, it'll go back and get whatever the number is from that same period last year. It's simply amazing. And again, the data model is designed to perform analytic DAX calculations efficiently and quickly. Now, an important note about data model. When you use the data model, that means either with PowerPivot or like last chapter, we imported data into the data model. Dates cannot be grouped in a pivot table. So we're going to get around that by building a calendar table. And all it will be is a type of lookup table where we look up the actual month name or day name or quarter name or something like that. Now, on the next sheet, the columnar database, we talked about the beauty of this last chapter. We also talked about all the synonyms you might encounter. Now, let's go to slide number 9 and talk about data modeling. Well, this is just another term. It really is just what we talked about. Now, data modeling is simply importing and transforming related tables, creating relationships between related tables, and creating formulas for those related tables to prepare the data so that we can make reports and perform analytics. Now, before Power Query and PowerPivot, what did we do when we did data modeling? We used Get External Data feature to get the data. We used Text to Columns to clean it. Sometimes we use formulas to clean our data. Then we use formulas, VLOOKUP function, helper columns, array formulas, and also other Excel features to prepare the data so we can make a report and perform analytics with pivot tables. Now, with Power Query and PowerPivot, we transform data, import it into the data model with Power Query. We create relationships between the related tables, create DAX calculated columns for row column filter criteria in our pivot table, create DAX measures or calculated fields to drop values into the value area of the pivot table. Also, we can make reports and perform analytics with pivot tables. Data modeling before, data modeling after Power Query and PowerPivot. Now I want to go to slide 10. Now we want to talk about related tables. And this is a typical transaction or sales table in Excel. Date, sales rep, product, discount, and units. But in order to calculate the net revenue for each transaction, we're going to have to get the price from this lookup table. Notice we would look up each one of the products, find it here, get the price, bring it back. Multiply it by discount and units to get our net revenue. Then if we wanted a report based on revenue by region, we'd have to do another lookup, looking up the sales rep name here, getting the region, and bringing it back. Now, the reason that we're looking at this related tables is because in Excel, we call this a transaction table, and we call these the two lookup tables. But with databasing and over in PowerPivot and data modeling, we have different names. This is going to be called a fact table, and these are going to be called the dimension tables. So terminology, transaction or sales, lookup, fact, dimension. Now I want to look at the next slide. And this is the last slide before we jump over to Excel. I just want to give you some references for more advanced PowerPivot and data model. And this is an amazing book. This is one of the many books that I read, Microsoft Excel 2013, Building Data Models with PowerPivot. Ferrari and Rousseau wrote this book, and also these two books about DAX formulas. So there's some good reference. Now, slide 18, I'm not going to go through them, but slide 18 all the way to 25 have really important notes about the calculated columns and measures or calculated fields. We're going to jump over to Excel and talk about them, but there's some important notes. Now I want to go over to Excel. And what we're going to do in this video is we're going to look at this example. And then next couple of videos, we'll see more advanced videos where we're importing data and doing some pretty amazing things with big data. But if I look at this data set, Control down arrow, this has got about 10,000 records. Control home. Our sales rep table has about 70 sales rep. And then we have approximately 12 products. Now, let's just quickly see how we would do this without PowerPivot. Of course, for revenue, right, we need to look up the price. So we do equals VLOOKUP. Now, VLOOKUP, we know how to use this. Look up the product. That's a relative cell reference, comma, within this table right here. And I'm going to lock it with the F4 key, comma, and I need to tell it the second column. And the last argument, comma, is exact match, so we put a 0. Now, here's VLOOKUP. When we get over to PowerPivot, there's going to be no VLOOKUP. Our VLOOKUP function will be called related. And related will be amazing, because if we use it, we're just going to say, hey, related, I need you to retrieve price from the price column in the products table. And it will know, because it's in the row with this product, to actually get the price. Now, of course, that wouldn't work here because VLOOKUP, we have the whole table here. But over in PowerPivot, because there's a relationship between the two tables, we won't need to do this. But of course, we'd copy that down, right? F2. Now, we're going to take that price, and then we multiply times 1 minus the discount rate. And here's another interesting thing. That's a relative cell reference. As I copy down, it'll always move. When we get over to PowerPivot, there's no relative cell references. We will actually build the same formula over there, 1 minus, but we'll actually have to put the name of the column in the table. And the calculated column will know, because it's in this row, to get the discount from this row. Close parentheses. Times our units. Same thing here. In Excel, we have a relative cell reference. We copy it down, and it keeps moving, right? But not over in PowerPivot when we're building our calculated columns. We will actually give the formula the name of the table and the field name. And because it's in the same row, it'll know to get that units. That will work if I Control Enter and copy it all the way down. I'm going to Control Shift tilde to wipe away the formatting, just to show us for a second that that's not going to work. We need to use the round function. I'm going to Control Z to put that number formatting back. Now I hit F2. Now here's the first thing that is going to be exactly the same over in PowerPivot. There's a round function over there. And you put a formula inside of it, and then comma 2 to round to the penny, close parentheses. Now I'm going to populate this all the way down, of course, with Control Enter. All right. Hey, guess what? What we did right there is a type of data modeling. We're just doing it in Excel, using Excel formulas and a helper column. Now the region equals VLOOKUP. Again, we won't have to do this over in PowerPivot because there'll be a relationship between these two tables, and we'll use the related function. But there's no relationship over here in Excel, so we have to put the whole table. Control Shift down arrow, F4 to lock it. Comma, region is in the second column, so I type 2. Again, over in PowerPivot, related function, we just tell it the column name that we want to go and get something from, and the table name where it is, and it will do the rest. Comma 0 for exact match, close parentheses. Control Enter, double click, and send it down. Now, one thing interesting about over here in Excel is if you've ever had a workbook with lots of VLOOKUPs and lots of huge tables, so many VLOOKUP functions start to slow down the calculation speed in an Excel workbook. Over in PowerPivot, for most data sets, that's just not going to happen because the DAX formulas and the columnar database are built for big data. Now, over here, it doesn't matter at all. You saw when I double-clicked and send it down, right? There was no delay whatsoever. But that's because we only have 10,000 records and only 2 helper columns. Now we can build our pivot table. Insert pivot table or Alt and V. And I'm going to put it on this sheet. Existing location, say 01, and click OK. Now notice over here in Excel with a standard pivot table, we have one field list. I'm going to drag region down to rows. Instantly, I get a unique list. Revenue down to values. Design, report layout. We'll actually still have to do design report layout when we do a pivot table based on a data model. But watch this. Here is an annoyance in standard pivot tables. Every time I build a new pivot table, I have to drag revenue down to values. And I may have 5 tables, or I may have multiple columns here, all with different calculations. But every single time, we have to right-click number formatting to add number formatting to the field. But guess what? When we get over to PowerPivot, when we build our either calculated column or calculated field or measure, those are our formulas. We will actually add number formatting one time. And every single time we drag that formula from our field list into the pivot table, it will already have the number formatting. All right, so that's how we did it in Excel. Let's go over and see how to do it with PowerPivot. Now, PowerPivot is right here. And we can click on the Add to Data Model. But that button right there is for when we have data in Excel. And it must be an official Excel table. Our first example here, we're just going to take data from our Excel tables, put it into PowerPivot, and see relationships and DAX formulas for the first time. In our next video, we'll get big data from external sources. But we have to convert this to a table. Insert table or Ctrl T. Click OK or hit Enter. Now, we want to always name our tables, Design, come up to Properties, and click up here. Or we can use the keyboard Alt-JTA. And notice I jump up here. I'm going to use the convention from databasing and data modeling to always put an F for fact table before my fact table or my transaction table. I'll call this F sales and Enter. Now I'm going to do this all with keyboards, right? Ctrl T, Enter, Alt J T A. And now I'm up here and I'm going to use the convention D for dimension. And this is sales rep and Enter. Click in a single cell, Ctrl T, Enter, Alt J T A, and I'm going to type D product. And you can see that up there and Enter. Now I can add each one of these to PowerPivot. I'm going to click in a single cell, PowerPivot, and add to data model. Now there is a keyboard, but oh my heavens. In every single version, they change the keys. So I'm just going to click the button here. Right? In 2010, 13, and 16, they all have different keyboards, Alt keyboard. Now it took a while there, and there it is. We clicked Add to Data Model, and it imported down here. You can see the little linked means it's linked back over there to Excel. If we change it over in our Excel table, it'll update here. D product, it took the name. And here we are. We are actually in the Manage Data Model window. And there's a Home tab, a Design tab, and a Linked Table tab. You could see up here, it has our file name up here, but this is the Manage. And you can see this up here. This is the Manage Data Model. You can actually click that button to go back over to Excel. I like to use Alt-Tab to go back and forth. This is Excel, Tab, and this is our Manage Data Model window. Now here's our table. And notice we have products and price. Now we don't necessarily need to do anything to this table because it's not going to be part of our end pivot table report. But you can come up and change column widths. You could even add some formatting up here. Now for this column right here, we are not going to drop this column into the pivot table. So we don't actually need to do that. Later when we start building formulas in our fact table, you see it says Add Column. That's where you would create a calculated column. And down below this is called the Measured Grid. That's where you would create our formulas. But this is just our first table, D product. We need to go back over to Excel. And now I'm going to click in the second table, PowerPivot, Add to Data Model. And just like that, D sales rep. Again, you don't really need to do anything to either one of these, but boom, there's our second table. Alt-Tab, Now we click in our fact table, PowerPivot, Add to Data Model. And there we go, 1, 2, 3. Now we can adjust the columns if you want. Notice that it actually did bring in a date and time, and we really only have dates here. Again, you don't have to fix this, but you can if you want. Here's formatting. I'm going to click the drop down and select just the second one for date. You could change the column widths if you want. Discount units. Now, this is the fact table. We actually will, and you can pull this up, we will create a calculated column and then create a calculated field or measure down in our measure grid. But first, we have to look over here in View. Data View, that's where you can see the tables, build your formulas. But we need to go over to Diagram View because here's where we can create our relationship. So I click, and there's our 3 tables. Here's the fact table. And just like in Access Relationship window, you can see your tables. You can adjust the size to see all the fields. Here's a dimension table. Here's a fact table. Here's a dimension table. Now, we need to build our relationship. And it is easy as this. The products needs to be related to the products field in the fact sales table. Sales rep needs to be related to sales rep over here. So we're simply going to click and drag. I'm dragging, dragging, dragging. When I see product light up in the fact table, I drop. Drag this up a little bit. And that's actually a one-to-many relationship. Now, there are other types of relationships you can build in PowerPivot. We're going to use one. That means the product column has the unique list in the lookup table. To many, that means we can have many products as we have many sales over here. Now let's do sales rep. Remember, sales rep is the first column in this lookup table. There's a unique list with duplicate regions, but I need to drag sales rep over to our facts table. And when I see sales rep light up, I drop it. Now notice when you're not selecting this actual line, it's hard to tell where that's going. It looks like it's going like in between product and discount. But if you click on it, you can clearly see it's sales rep to sales rep. Click over here clearly from product to product. Now I'm going to Control S to save those relationships. And now I can come over to Data View. And now we're going to create our first calculated column because we have discount units, but we do not have net revenue. So I'm going to double click where it says Add Column and call this Net Revenue and Enter. Now we can click in the top cell. And as soon as we type an equal sign, it shoots me up to the formula bar. Now there's a difference between a calculated column, and down here it'll be called a measure or a calculated field. When you start a calculated column, you use an equal sign, just like over in Excel. Later, when we create our measure or calculated field, we're going to use an equal sign and a colon. All right, so just an equal sign. Now we need to look up the price. And there is no VLOOKUP, so we're going to use this new function related. And luckily, we have a drop-down of function names just like we do in Excel. I can hit Tab. And all it wants is the column name from the related table. So I'm going to click over on D Product and then click on Price. Notice it puts the table name, D Products, and then in square brackets, it puts the field name. Now, those square brackets should be somewhat familiar because Excel tables use square brackets for their field names. Also, if you remember Access, Access uses square brackets for field names. Close parentheses. And watch this. When I hit Enter, it populates all the way down. Now, we can click in any cell we want, but the formula is the same all the way down. As we mentioned when we were over in Excel building our VLOOKUP. VLOOKUP, copy the formula down, and there's relative and absolute cell references. But all there is here is table name, field name. There's all the prices. Now, that's not the complete formula, so we can click back in the formula bar, times, and then open parentheses. Now we need to do 1 minus the discount. But watch this. If we click on discount, It's polite. It puts in just the field name. But that does not fit our convention for building formulas. Anytime we use a column name, we're actually going to type the table name and the field name. So I'm going to start over. I'm going to go 1 minus. Well, the name of this table is F sales. So watch this, FS. And I can see it says F sales and the T means table. I can down arrow, down arrow. And when I see F sales square bracket discount, I can hit tab. That's our convention. Now we're going to use that convention even though, as you saw here, when I click, it's going to put in just the field name. We're going to use that convention because we're going to reserve square brackets alone for when we use calculated fields in other formulas. Every time we use a column from a table or a field from a table, we're going to use the convention table name and square brackets field name. All right, close parentheses. Now I need times and then F sales, arrow, 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 and I need units. Now look at this formula. It is totally different than over in Excel. There's no relative cell references. We mentioned over in Excel that that would be a relative cell reference looking at 2 cells to my left, and this would be a relative cell reference looking 1 cell to my left. But this is in the realm of databasing where we use field names for everything. All right, so when I hit enter, it populates all the way down. Just like over in Excel, we saw these numbers are not officially rounded, and we need to round to the penny. So I come back up to my formula. And luckily, there's at least a few functions that are exactly the same. So round, that whole number right there is that big, long formula. I come to the end, comma, 2, because we're rounding to the penny, close parentheses, and enter. Now I want to click down in row number 5. And look at this formula up here. There's just a bunch of table names and field names. So how in the world did it know to get the price for Carlota? Because actually, the related right here looked up the price for Carlota. This F sales discount somehow got the 2%, and this F sales units somehow got the number of units too. The way it did it is row context, because we don't see relative cell references here, so it's not looking 1, 2 to my left. It's using row context. So related, it knew to get the related product in this row because the formula is right there. So the row context said, get Carlota, go get the price. The row context for discount said, hey, I'm in this row, so get that discount. Same for units. That's called row context. Now, this formula right here, we potentially could use it over in the pivot table, although we're going to see that there's a better way than dropping this field into the pivot table. But I want to show you something. If I click on this number formatting right here, sure enough, it adds the number formatting. If I ever drag that field to the pivot table, that number formatting will follow. Now, I actually want to build a pivot table from this and just see if we can do a regional report by revenue. Now, in the long run, we're not going to take this column, like I said, and drop it into the pivot table. We're going to build our total revenue, total net revenue formula down here as a measure or a calculated field. But let's just take a look. I'm going to click, and this is the pivot table button inside the Manage Data Model ribbon tab, right? I'm going to click Pivot Table and then Pivot Table. It will actually insert a new sheet inside the Excel workbook. I'm going to click OK. And I'm going to leave it sheet 1 because I'm going to delete it in just a second. We want to go to D Sales Rep, and I want to drag region down to rows. Instantly, we get that unique list. Notice we still have the problem with that report layout, but no problem. I'm now going to go over to F Sales, and there's the net revenue. And when I drag it down here, check that out. The number formatting followed it. Now, this is called an implicit formula. And what it means is we took a field and put it into the values area and relied on the internal functions or calculations of the pivot table. That's called implicit formula. And we don't want to do that in the long run. If we're going to be efficient, we don't want to use the functions and calculations inside a pivot table. We want to always use DAX formula. So we're actually going to delete this sheet, go back over to our Manage Data Model and create what's called a calculated field that will show up here. The synonym for calculated field is measure. And we're going to go create it over there with the DAX function, and it's the sum function, so it works exactly the same as the sum function in a pivot table or in the cells. But we're going to let DAX do it because the DAX functions work more efficiently with the data model and the columnar database. All right, so I'm going to delete this sheet, right-click Delete, and then delete. Alt-Tab to get over to Manage Data Model. And now watch this. This is the first time we've come down to the measure grid. And we're going to actually, like we did in Access, actually have to type the name of the calculated field or measure and then the formula. So watch this. I'm going to type total net. And as I'm typing, you can see it start to emerge up in the formula bar. Total net revenue. And watch this. I'm going to have to type it colon and then an equal sign and then sum. Now, if you remember back to Access, when we created calculated fields in our queries, we had to type the, in essence, field name over there and a colon. And then everything after the colon was a formula. But here in PowerPivot, we type a colon, then an equal sign, and then the rest of our formula. And look at that. Sum is another function. It's a DAX function, tab. And it wants a column name. Our convention is always to put the table name. So FS to get to F sales table. And down arrow. And notice it says F sales, sum of net revenue. And it has an M for measure. That option in this dropdown would not have shown up unless we built the pivot table and did our implicit calculation. We don't ever want to use that. We're going to up arrow. And the one we want to use, that's the calculated column we just created here. So I'm going to hit Tab. We're using our DAX sum with our calculated column, close parentheses, and Enter. That is our first measure or calculated field. Now we have to add some number formatting. You can right-click Format, or you can simply use the buttons up here. I'm going to use the English with a $sign. And there it is. That's our first measure or calculated field. Now we want to create a pivot table. So I come up and click the button inside Manage Data Model, New Sheet. It's going to put it inside our Excel workbook. Click OK. Now I'm going to come over to D Sales Rep, drag the region down to rows. Instantly we get a unique list. Open up our F sales, and we have a choice between net revenue. If I drag this down here, it does an implicit calculation using the pivot table sum. But I want to use my DAX measure or calculated field. And when I drag it down to values, boom, that is our first pivot table from our PowerPivot data model. Now I'm going to go up to Design. We still have to do this report layout and show in tabular. Come down to the sheet, double click, and we call that Region Report, and Enter. Now I'm going to click up in one of the cells in the Values area and talk about filtered context. Whereas with calculated columns, we have row context. In a pivot table, when we drag our measure or calculated field, remember, there it is, that calculated field, we dragged it down there. How in the world did it know to get 158,819.85 cents? Because if I go and look at my data model and I expose this column right here, it says the total net revenue is 905,702. That's, if I click here, that's what that formula is evaluating to. So that means there's a formula, there's the answer. But guess what? When I drop it into a pivot table, that's a formula that respects that criteria from the row area. And get this, I can drag any other criteria down here, and instantly it respects the criteria that I drop into the row area, the column area, or filter or slicer. That is amazing. That means we have a formula that will change depending on the criteria or filter in our pivot table. Not only that, but that formula sitting in that cell, that is the filter context. It's looking at South and Aspen, and it's actually filtering the fact table to show only records with South and only records with Aspen. That means that formula actually has to calculate over fewer rows. Now, if you think of that in comparison to array formulas, where array formulas, if you have a full range, it's always looking at the full range, but not the DAX formulas. It is calculating only on the filtered table. That aspect helps DAX formulas calculate quickly on big data. So there is our first example of building a data model in PowerPivot and creating a report. If we come back over Alt Tab. So in this video, we learned how to create a data model in PowerPivot. And what did we do? We first imported all 3 tables from over in Excel, and they had to be Excel tables over there to get them into our managed data model. We then went to diagram view and created relationships between related tables. Then in data view, we created a calculated column. There's the formula, a calculated field or measure. And then what did we do? We clicked that button to create a pivot table. And we started off by talking about how we would build a data model to prepare our data for a pivot table report before PowerPivot. All right, next video, get ready because we are going to import big data into the data model, create relationships between related tables, create a bunch of calculated columns and calculated fields or measures, and get busy making some awesome updatable reports. All right, we'll see you next video for big data modeling in PowerPivot. See you next video.